Welcome to Trend Reddit, where I share interesting, useful, and inspiring content. Let's explore the world together through the videos I create. Don't forget to click the follow button so you don't miss anything new. Thank you for visiting and hope we have great experiences together. Emily Carter rushed down the bustling New York City street, her heart pounding in her chest as she glanced at her watch. "I can't be late again," she muttered under her breath. Her job at one of the city's leading financial firms was everything to her, and her boss, Mr. Anderson, was known for his strict, almost unforgiving, attitude toward punctuality. If she was late again, the consequences would likely be severe. Despite her urgency, Emily found herself drawn into the aroma of freshly brewed coffee as she passed her favorite cafe. Just a quick stop, she thought, rationalizing the detour. She grabbed a cup to fuel her through what was sure to be another long day, then continued her frantic race to the office. As Emily walked briskly through the crowded sidewalk, her attention was caught by a man staggering nearby. His face was pale, his steps unsteady. He looked confused, lost in the sea of people who flowed around him without a second glance. Emily slowed her pace, her concern piqued. Something was wrong. "Are you okay?" Emily asked, stepping toward the man. His response was a faint, breathless gasp, and his knees buckled beneath him. Instinctively, Emily caught his arm, lowering him gently to the ground. The bystanders continued to move on, indifferent to the man's distress. Emily, however, couldn't ignore the urgency of the situation. "He's having a heart attack," she realized, her heart sinking. Without a second thought, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled as she relayed the situation to the dispatcher. The minutes dragged on as Emily stayed by the man's side, trying to keep him conscious. "Help is on the way," she whispered, feeling a sense of responsibility wash over her. Even as her thoughts flickered back to the office, knowing she was running out of time, she couldn't bring herself to leave him. She stayed, her hand on his shoulder, reassuring him as they waited for the ambulance. Finally, the wail of sirens cut through the noise of the city. Paramedics rushed to the scene, taking over as they assessed the man's condition. Emily hovered nearby, still shaken but determined not to leave until she knew he would be okay. As the paramedics loaded him onto the stretcher, Emily made a split-second decision. She would accompany him to the hospital. Work could wait. At that moment, as the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle sped toward the nearest hospital, Emily had no idea that her choice to help a stranger would alter the course of her life forever. Emily watched as the paramedics worked swiftly, moving the man, now barely conscious, onto the stretcher. His face was ghostly pale, his breathing shallow. The severity of his condition was unmistakable, and Emily's heart raced with worry. She felt a strong urge to stay, to see this through. Even though every minute she spent here was a minute she would be late for work, something in her couldn't walk away. As the ambulance's doors swung open, one of the paramedics looked at her and asked, "Are you a relative?" "No," Emily replied, shaking her head. "I just found him like this. He looked like he needed help." The paramedic gave her a quick nod of appreciation. "You did the right thing. He's lucky you were there." Emily stood on the sidewalk, watching as the stretcher was pushed inside the ambulance. She felt a pang of uncertainty, her mind torn between duty and responsibility. Work was important, but a man's life was on the line. Something deep within her told her she couldn't just turn her back now. Without hesitation, she took a step forward and spoke to the paramedic again. "Can I go with you? I want to make sure he's okay." The paramedic hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Sure, hop in." Emily climbed into the ambulance, her pulse quickening. As they sped through the city streets, the lights flashing and the siren wailing, she couldn't stop her thoughts from wandering back to the office. She knew Mr. Anderson wouldn't accept her excuse. He wasn't the kind of man who cared about anything outside of work. Emily bit her lip, trying to push the worry out of her mind. This felt more important, even if it cost her everything she had worked for. In the back of the ambulance, Emily watched anxiously as the paramedics monitored the man's vitals. His condition seemed to be stabilizing, but there was still an air of uncertainty. She wanted to say something comforting, but her words stuck in her throat. What could she possibly say to a man she didn't even know? The ride to the hospital felt like both an eternity and a blur. Emily's mind swirled with conflicting emotions. She barely noticed when they arrived at the emergency room. The paramedics rushed the man inside, leaving Emily standing on the curb, momentarily lost. She glanced at her phone. 3 hours late. Her stomach dropped. She knew there was no coming back from this at work. Mr. Anderson would fire her without a second thought. The realization hit her hard, but she didn't regret her decision. Inside the hospital, the man was taken into emergency care. Emily stood awkwardly in the waiting area, not sure what to do next. She had no obligation to stay, yet something anchored her there. A nurse passed by, and Emily asked about the man's condition. "He's in stable condition," the nurse replied kindly. "We're doing everything we can." A flood of relief washed over Emily, but it was followed by a sinking feeling of dread about her job. The right thing wasn't always the easy thing, and now, as she glanced once more at her phone, she realized just how high the cost of her decision might be. Emily sat in the hospital waiting room, her heart pounding as the weight of what she had done began to sink in. She had been at the hospital for hours, anxiously waiting for updates about the man she had helped, Michael Collins, as she later learned. But now, the reality of her own situation was pressing down on her. She checked her phone again and saw the time. 3 hours late. Her stomach churned with dread. With a deep breath, Emily stood up and made her way out of the hospital, leaving behind the sterile halls and quiet hum of medical machinery. She had done the right thing, she told herself, but the consequences were waiting for her, just a subway ride away. As the train rattled through the underground tunnels, Emily rehearsed her explanation over and over in her head. Surely, Mr. Anderson would understand that she had saved a man's life. But deep down, she knew the truth. He wouldn't care. Punctuality was everything to him. When she arrived at the office, the usual bustling energy felt like a storm looming in the distance. Her coworkers barely glanced at her as she hurried to her desk, but the tension in the air was palpable. She hadn't even sat down before Mr. Anderson's sharp voice cut through the room. "Emily. My office. Now." Her heart sank. She followed him into the office, bracing herself for what was coming. Mr. Anderson stood behind his desk, arms crossed, his expression stony and cold. "You're 3 hours late," he said, his voice clipped. "This isn't the first time, Emily. I've given you warnings. You know our policy on punctuality." "I know," Emily stammered, her palms sweating. "But, please, I can explain. There was a man, he was having a heart attack. I couldn't just leave him there. I called an ambulance, and I went with him to the hospital. He—" "I don't care," Mr. Anderson interrupted, his tone as icy as his gaze. "You've missed deadlines, meetings, and now, this. You've made your choices, and those choices have consequences. You're fired." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Emily blinked, stunned. She had expected a reprimand, maybe even a warning, but not this. Not being fired. Not after everything she had done. She opened her mouth to protest, but the look on Mr. Anderson's face told her it was pointless. "Clear out your desk," he said, already turning away from her. "Security will escort you out." Emily stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. She wanted to scream, to tell him how unfair this was, how she had saved a life, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Mr. Anderson was immovable. Numbly, she walked back to her desk and began gathering her things. Her coworkers avoided eye contact, but she could feel their curiosity, their judgment, like a weight pressing down on her. She packed her belongings into a box, her hands shaking, and walked toward the exit. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Emily stared at the floor, fighting back tears. She had done the right thing. She knew that. But right now, it didn't feel like enough. She had lost her job, and with it, the security she had worked so hard to build. And for what? To help a man she didn't even know? Stepping out onto the street, Emily took a deep breath of the crisp city air. The noise of New York surrounded her, the familiar hum of life moving on, indifferent to her struggles. She stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. Her life had changed in a matter of hours, and now she had to figure out what came next. In the days following her dismissal, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the man she had helped, Michael Collins. Despite everything that had happened, despite losing her job and the uncertainty looming over her, she felt an inexplicable pull toward him. She had no idea why. He was a stranger, after all, someone she had met in a moment of crisis. But the connection she felt was undeniable. It wasn't guilt or regret that drove her thoughts. No, it was something deeper. She felt a strange sense of responsibility for him, like she had been placed in his path for a reason. Every day, as she woke up and faced the daunting task of looking for a new job, her thoughts drifted back to him. Was he okay? Had he recovered? Finally, after several days of indecision, Emily found herself standing in the hospital lobby once again. She hadn't planned to visit him, but her feet had carried her here before her mind could catch up. The hospital smelled the same as it had before, sterile, faintly medicinal, and oddly comforting. She approached the information desk and hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Excuse me, I'm here to check on a patient. His name is Michael Collins. He was brought in a few days ago." The nurse at the desk looked up from her computer, her expression kind but businesslike. "Michael Collins," she repeated, typing the name into her system. After a few moments, she nodded. "He's still here. Stable, but unconscious." Emily's heart sank at the news, but she wasn't entirely surprised. At least he was stable. That was something. She thanked the nurse and found her way to the intensive care unit, feeling strangely nervous. What was she doing here? Why did she care so much about someone she didn't even know? When she reached his room, she stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the man lying in the hospital bed. He looked peaceful, despite the machines and wires surrounding him. His chest rose and fell steadily, and for the first time since that day, Emily felt a small sense of relief. She stepped into the room and sat down in the chair beside his bed. The room was quiet, except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Emily sat there for a long time, unsure of what to do. She felt ridiculous for coming, but at the same time, she couldn't bring herself to leave. "I don't even know why I'm here," she whispered, more to herself than to him. I couldn't stop thinking about you." There was no response, of course. Michael remained still, unconscious, but Emily found herself talking anyway. She talked about her job, about how she had been fired for helping him, about the uncertainty she now faced. She told him about her life in New York, the struggles, the loneliness, and the frustration that came with living in such a relentless city. And as she spoke, she realized just how much she had bottled up over the years. Each visit became easier after that. Emily returned to the hospital day after day, sometimes sitting in silence, sometimes sharing her thoughts and fears with the man who couldn't respond. It was oddly comforting, talking to someone who couldn't judge her, who wouldn't offer advice or try to fix things. She didn't expect anything in return. She didn't even know if he would ever wake up. But there was something about those quiet moments with Michael that gave Emily peace. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe, like she didn't have to pretend that everything was fine. And even though she didn't understand the strange connection she felt with him, she knew that, for now, it was enough to keep her going. Weeks passed, and Emily found herself in a routine that revolved around her visits to the hospital. Every day, she would arrive, sit by Michael's side, and talk to him about everything and nothing at all. It was becoming her way of coping with the uncertainty of her own life. The job search wasn't going well, and with each rejection, the idea of staying in New York seemed less viable. She was running out of options, out of money, and out of hope. Emily knew that soon she would have to make a decision. She couldn't keep visiting the hospital indefinitely, couldn't keep pouring her heart out to a man who might never wake up. As much as she had come to depend on these moments of quiet solace, she knew it was time to move on. Her life was at a standstill, and she couldn't keep waiting for something, anything, to change. One rainy afternoon, Emily sat by Michael's bed, her heart heavy with the weight of goodbye. She hadn't planned to tell him, hadn't even thought about how to say it, but the words spilled out before she could stop them. "I think this is my last visit," she said softly, her eyes focused on the raindrops sliding down the window. "I've been coming here for weeks, and I feel like... I don't know, maybe I've been using you as an excuse not to deal with my own problems." She glanced at Michael, still lying motionless, his breathing steady but unconscious. "I've lost my job, I'm not sure what I'm doing with my life, and I keep coming here because it's easier than facing all of that. But I think it's time for me to go. I need to figure things out, and I don't think I can do that here." Emily felt a lump form in her throat as she stood up, smoothing the wrinkles in her coat. "I don't know if you can hear me, but thank you. You gave me something to hold on to when I didn't have anything else. I hope you wake up soon. I hope you get your life back." With that, Emily turned and walked toward the door, her heart aching as she left the room. She didn't look back as she exited the hospital, the cold rain hitting her face as she stepped out onto the street. It felt like the end of something, but also the beginning of something new. She wasn't sure what her next step would be, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like she was ready to find out. What Emily didn't know was that after she left, something shifted. Michael Collins, who had been lying in that hospital bed for weeks, began to stir. His fingers twitched, his breathing deepened, and though it was slow and subtle, the signs of life returning were there. The nurses didn't notice at first, but as the minutes passed, Michael's eyes fluttered open for the first time since his collapse on the street. And though he was weak and disoriented, one thing was clear in his mind, the voice that had been speaking to him in the darkness, the words of encouragement and comfort that had helped him hold on. It was her. He didn't know her name, but he knew she had been there. And now that he was awake, he was determined to find her. Michael Collins slowly regained consciousness, his mind clouded and disoriented as the bright lights of the hospital room filtered through his heavy eyelids. His body felt weak, as though he had been lying still for weeks, and the dull beeping of machines filled the silence around him. For a moment, he couldn't place where he was or how he had gotten there. But then, fragments of memory began to emerge, bits and pieces that didn't fully make sense. As he lay there, trying to make sense of it all, one thing became clear in his muddled thoughts: the voice. A woman's voice had been with him in the darkness, soft and comforting, speaking words that anchored him when everything else seemed to fade away. He couldn't remember much of what she had said, but the sound of her voice was imprinted in his mind, like a lifeline that had pulled him through. He tried to move, but his limbs felt foreign, unresponsive after so long without use. The effort exhausted him, and he sank back into the bed, his heart rate quickening slightly as he became more aware of his surroundings. The room was quiet, and no one seemed to notice that he had woken up. Michael's mind kept circling back to that voice. Who was she? How long had she been there? And why had she stayed? It wasn't just the memory of her voice that lingered, there was a sense of connection, like she had been with him for far longer than he could comprehend. A nurse finally entered the room, her eyes widening when she saw that Michael was awake. She rushed over to his bedside, checking the monitors and fussing over his condition. "Mr. Collins," she said with a warm smile, "you're awake. You've been unconscious for several weeks. You've made a remarkable recovery." Michael nodded weakly, trying to find his voice. His throat felt dry and raw, and when he finally spoke, his words came out hoarse and strained. There was a woman," he managed to say, his thoughts still cloudy. She was here." The nurse looked puzzled for a moment before her expression softened with understanding. "Yes, there was someone who came to see you regularly. She wasn't family, but she visited you almost every day." Michael's heart leaped. She wasn't just a figment of his imagination. She had been real, and she had been there with him. "Who is she?" Michael asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I need to find her." The nurse hesitated. I don't know much about her. She didn't leave her name, but she seemed very concerned about you. She spoke to you often, even though you were unconscious. I'm sure we can find her if you want to meet her. Michael's mind raced as he tried to recall more details about the woman. Her voice had been a beacon in the haze, and now that he was awake, he felt an overwhelming need to thank her, to see her, to understand why she had been there for him. Yes, he said firmly, gathering as much strength as he could muster. Please, help me find her. Over the next few days, as Michael began his slow recovery, he remained focused on the mysterious woman who had been by his side. The hospital staff tried to locate her, but without a name or any other details, it was difficult to track her down. But Michael refused to give up. He couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason, and he was determined to find out why. As the days went by, Michael grew stronger, and his resolve to find her only deepened. He didn't know how long it would take or what he would say when he finally found her, but he knew one thing for certain: the woman who had stayed by his side during his darkest hours had changed his life, and he wouldn't rest until he found her. Emily was standing at the entrance of her apartment, suitcase in hand, ready to leave New York behind. Her job search had gone nowhere, and the city that once promised so much now felt suffocating. It was time for a fresh start, even if she didn't know exactly where that would be. She had said her goodbyes to the few friends she had made, packed up her things, and was now about to catch a train to her sister's place upstate. As she took one last look around the apartment, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She ignored it at first, not in the mood for more rejection emails or concerned texts, but the buzzing persisted. With a sigh, she fished her phone out of her pocket and glanced at the screen. It was an unfamiliar number. Hello? Emily answered, her voice wary. Emily? A male voice came through, hesitant but unmistakably familiar. It's Michael Collins. Her breath caught in her throat. Michael. The man she had visited in the hospital for weeks, the man she thought she'd never see awake. Michael, she repeated, stunned. You're awake? I am, he said, his voice stronger now. And I've been trying to find you. The nurses told me you'd been visiting me while I was unconscious. I can't even begin to thank you. Emily blinked, her mind reeling. She had never expected to hear from him, never thought she'd hear his voice so full of life after seeing him in that hospital bed for so long. I didn't do much, she said, her voice softer now. I couldn't leave you there. I wanted to make sure you were okay. Well, I am okay, thanks to you, Michael replied. I don't know what kept me holding on, but I remember your voice. It was like, you were there with me, keeping me anchored. I need to see you, to thank you in person. Emily hesitated, looking at her suitcase by the door. I'm actually about to leave the city, she admitted, unsure of what else to say. Wait, please, Michael said, a note of urgency in his voice. Where are you? I can come to you. Emily glanced at the clock, realizing she still had time before her train left. Something in Michael's voice made her pause. She had spent weeks by his side, pouring her heart out to him, and now here he was, awake and wanting to meet her. It felt like fate was pulling her back. I'm at my apartment, she finally said, giving him the address. But I'm leaving soon. I'll be there as fast as I can, Michael promised before the call ended. Emily stood there, her heart racing, unsure of what to expect. She had never anticipated this, never thought their paths would cross again after she said her tearful goodbye in the hospital. And yet, here he was, coming to see her. In less than an hour, there was a knock at her door. When she opened it, there stood Michael, looking a little tired but very much alive. His eyes were filled with gratitude and something else, something that made Emily's heart skip a beat. Hi, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hi, Michael replied, his smile warmed despite the exhaustion on his face. I'm so glad I found you. Emily stepped aside, letting him into the apartment. They stood there for a moment, the weight of everything that had happened between them, everything that hadn't been said, hanging in the air. "I don't know how to thank you," Michael began, his voice sincere. "You didn't have to stay with me, but you did. And I heard you, even when I couldn't respond. You have no idea how much that meant to me." Emily smiled softly, her heart swelling with emotion. "I didn't expect anything in return. I couldn't leave you alone." "Well, I'm not letting you go without properly thanking you," Michael said, his expression growing serious. "I want to help you. I own a company, and we have positions open. I think you'd be perfect for one of them. Please, let me repay you. If you think the story is good, leave a comment with the number 1, and if not, please subscribe to the channel. If the video is helpful to you, don't forget to hit the like button." Emily was taken aback. She hadn't expected an offer like this, but there was something genuine in his eyes that made her feel like this was more than just a job offer. It was a new beginning. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, still processing everything. "Say yes," Michael said, his smile returning. "You saved my life, Emily. Let me give you something in return." And for the first time in weeks, Emily felt like maybe her life was taking a turn for the better. She smiled at Michael and nodded. "Okay," she said. "Yes." Emily sat at her new desk, surrounded by the sleek, modern decor of Collins Industries. It felt surreal, sitting there in her office with a view of the city she had been so close to leaving. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of change, and yet, everything had fallen into place so naturally. Michael's offer had come at the perfect time, and now here she was, working at a company that, just weeks ago, she hadn't even known existed. Her new role was challenging, but in a way that excited her. She was learning fast, picking up on the ins and outs of the business under Michael's guidance. He had been patient with her, ensuring that she had everything she needed to succeed, but he also pushed her to be better. It was clear that he saw potential in her, and for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she was living up to it. Michael was more than just her boss now. Their professional connection had deepened into something more personal, something she hadn't expected but couldn't deny. They spent long hours together, working side by side, but it was in the quiet moments, the lunches they shared, the late nights going over projects, where they truly got to know one another. The bond that had begun in the hospital, when she had sat by his side and talked to him without expecting anything in return, had blossomed into something far more significant. Emily found herself looking forward to those moments with Michael, her heart skipping a beat whenever he walked into the room. She hadn't been sure how to handle her growing feelings at first. After all, he was her boss, and she didn't want to jeopardize the new opportunity he had given her. But Michael, in his own quiet way, made it clear that he felt the same. One evening, after they had finished a long day of meetings, Michael invited her to dinner. They had done this before, but something about the way he asked this time felt different. There was a nervousness in his voice, a vulnerability that Emily hadn't seen before. As they sat at the restaurant, the city lights twinkling through the large windows, Michael finally said what they had both been dancing around for weeks. "Emily," he began, his voice soft but steady, "there's something I need to tell you. These last few weeks, you've become more than just an employee to me. I've come to care about you, more than I ever expected. I know this might complicate things, but I couldn't keep it to myself any longer." Emily's heart raced as she listened to his words. She had known, deep down, that this moment was coming, but hearing him say it out loud still took her breath away. She looked into his eyes, seeing the sincerity and warmth there, and realized that she felt the same. "I care about you too, Michael," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect any of this to happen, but I'm glad it did." From that moment on, their relationship shifted. They continued to work together, maintaining a professional front during business hours, but outside of the office, they allowed themselves to explore the connection that had been growing between them. It wasn't always easy, navigating a personal relationship while working together had its challenges, but they were committed to making it work. Emily often thought back to the day she had found Michael on the street, barely conscious, and how that one moment had changed the course of both their lives. If she hadn't stopped to help him, if she had simply walked away, none of this would have happened. But she hadn't walked away. She had stayed, and in doing so, had opened the door to a new life, a new beginning. As she looked out at the city skyline from her office window, Emily smiled. Life had a funny way of surprising you, she thought. And she was ready for whatever came next, with Michael by her side. Emily sat by the window in her office, the sun beginning to set over the city, casting a warm, golden glow across the skyline. She reflected on how drastically her life had changed in just a few short months. What had started as an ordinary day, rushing to work, worrying about being late, had turned into the beginning of a journey she never could have anticipated. She thought about Michael, the man whose life she had saved without even knowing it at the time. That moment of compassion, the decision to stop and help a stranger, had set everything in motion. It hadn't just changed his life, it had changed hers as well. Losing her job had seemed like the end of the world at the time, but now, looking back, she realized it had been the beginning of something far better. Her new position at Collins Industries had given her the sense of purpose and challenge she had been craving. The work was hard, but rewarding, and she felt like she was truly contributing to something meaningful. Michael had been a huge part of that, not just as her boss but as someone who had come to mean so much more to her. Their relationship had blossomed slowly, naturally, over time. It wasn't just about the job or the fact that they had been through something extraordinary together. It was about the connection they had built, the late-night conversations, the shared moments of vulnerability, the quiet understanding that seemed to grow between them with each passing day. Emily smiled to herself as she thought about how far they had come. Michael had been hesitant at first, worried about how their relationship might affect their work, but in the end, they had found a way to make it work. Their bond had only strengthened as they navigated the challenges together, both in the office and in their personal lives. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Emily's thoughts drifted back to that fateful day when she had first met Michael. She had been scared, unsure of what to do, but something inside her had told her to stay, to help. She had no idea then that her decision to act on instinct, to follow her heart, would lead her to where she was now. And where she was now felt right. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. She was surrounded by people who valued her, doing work that challenged and fulfilled her, and most importantly, she had found someone who truly cared about her. Michael had told her more than once how grateful he was that she had saved his life, but the truth was, Emily felt like they had saved each other. In helping him, she had found a new sense of purpose, a new direction. She had discovered strength within herself that she hadn't known was there. As the evening sky turned a deep shade of blue, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. Life had a way of taking unexpected turns, of throwing challenges in your path when you least expected them. But sometimes, those challenges led to something better, something more beautiful than you could have ever imagined. With Michael by her side, Emily was ready for whatever the future held. She didn't know what was coming next, but she knew she could face it with confidence and hope. Because, in the end, everything had fallen into place in a way she never could have planned. And she was grateful for the twists and turns, for the moments of uncertainty, and most of all, for the chance encounter that had changed her life forever. As she watched the last rays of sunlight fade into the horizon, Emily smiled to herself. It wasn't the life she had expected, but it was the life she had chosen. And that made all the difference.